The chipped ceramic rooster, 37 times removed from any farm, was the first indication, not the missing persons reports. Those were statistical noise in a county already hemorrhaging population. But the rooster, it sat on the dashboard of my cruiser, a souvenir from the abandoned gas station off Route 9, and its painted eye followed me. Not with observation, but with forfeit calculation. I, Milo Lee, was tasked with finding Old Man Hemlock, his grandson, vanished 3 days prior. Hemlock, a man whose face resembled a dried plum. Hadn't he offered much beyond a grunt, and the claim the boy had been taken by the static? Rural nonsense. The drive wound through fields of brittle corn stalks, the stalks themselves like skeletal fingers clawing at the grey sky. The boy, Daniel, was a loner, apparently obsessed with mapping the network of forgotten service roads that spiderwebbed through the county. Hemlock said Daniel believed these roads weren't meant for cars, that they shifted. I dismissed it as grief, addled rambling the cruiser, as radio sputtered, briefly resolving into a burst of distorted polka music before collapsing back into white noise. Annoying, but typical for this stretch of highway. I found Daniel S. truck parked near the Blackwood Creek Bridge, the engine cold. No sign of a struggle, just an open atlas spread across the passenger seat, circled with frantic looping lines. The creek itself was a sluggish, viscous black, reflecting the sky like a bruised eye. A calico cat, lean and watchful, sat perched on the bridge railing, regarding me with an unnervingly steady gaze. Didn't he blink? Didn't he react to my approach? Just free-watched. The atlas focused on a section of road marked only as County Line Extension. A road that, according to my maps, didn't exist. I drove, following the barely, their track Daniel had highlighted, the cruiser bumping and grinding over overgrown gravel. The trees pressed closer, their branches intertwined like grasping hands. The air smelled not of pine or earth, but of something acrid, like burnt sugar and old metal. A distant rhythmic thudding began to resonate through the chassis of the vehicle, growing louder with each passing mile. The road opened into a clearing, revealing a structure that shouldn't to have been. A building constructed from mismatched sections of other buildings, a diner booth welded to a brick wall, a section of porch roof jutting out over a concrete slab. It resembled a butcher assembling parts, a grotesque collage of architectural failures. The thudding intensified, now clearly originating from Furency-dyed, the structure. And the cat, having somehow kept pace, sat on the roof, still watching, still silent. The air was thick with a bitter, chemical scent, and a single flickering fluorescent light illuminated a doorway. I killed the engine. The thudding stopped. The doorway led not into a building, but into a corridor. Not constructed, but Tufi excised. Excised Tufiality had been cleanly removed and replaced with something. Else the walls weren't wood or brick, but a substance resembling polished bone, cool and strangely yielding to the touch. The thudding hadn't ceased, merely relocated. It resonated twin within the bone, a slow, deliberate pulse. My flashlight beam fractured against the walls, revealing no seams, no discernible construction, just seamless, curving surfaces. I called out, "Daniel Hemlock." My voice sounded thin, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The calico remained on the roof, a static point in the shifting periphery. I proceeded cautiously, the beam cutting through the gloom. The corridor branched, splitting into a network of identical passages. Each turn revealed more of the same bone-like material, the same unsettling pulse. The smell intensified, now overlaid with something faintly floral, like decaying lilies. A room opened to the left. Inside, a collection of televisions all displaying the same image, static. Not the white noise of a broken signal, but a dense, swirling grey that seemed to Fuitmove, to writhe with internal energy. The screens were arranged in a circle, facing inwards, and in the center stood a figure. Back to me, slender. Wearing overalls. Daniel's build. "Oh, Daniel," I repeated, raising my voice. The figure didn't respond. I approached, the flashlight beam trembling slightly. As I drew closer, I noticed the figure wasn't simply standing. It was folding, limbs bending at impossible angles, torso contorting, as if being compressed by an unseen force. The static on the screens intensified, the grey swirling faster, and the thudding within the walls reached a fever pitch. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" I demanded, reaching out to grab Daniel's shoulder. My hand passed through him, not like a ghost, but like smoke. The air where his body should have been felt cold, devoid of substance. The figure continued to fold, collapsing inwards until it resembled a crumpled marionette. Then, A voice. Not from the figure, but from the televisions. A chorus of voices, layered and distorted, speaking in unison. He's calibrating, adjusting to the frequency. The lines are thinning. I spun around, searching for the source of the voices, but the room was empty save for the screens and the remnant of Daniel. The calico leaped from the roof, landing silently on the bone floor. It walked towards the collapsed figure, circling it slowly, then looked up at me, its eyes glowing with an unsettling luminescence. It emitted a single guttural meow sigh, not a sound of distress, but of acknowledgement. I noticed something then, something I hadn't seen before. Small, circular indentations on the bone walls, spaced at regular intervals. Each indentation contained a single dried flower honey lee, its petals brittle and brown, and beneath the floral scent, a faint metallic tang. The taste of copper coated the back of my throat. I ran a gloved hand along the wall, tracing the indentations. They weren't random. They formed a pattern, a map. A map of the service roads. The map wasn't a representation of geography, but of 2 feet intervals, say. The distance between the flower-filled indentations didn't to correspond to physical distance, but to something else, a rhythm, a frequency. Each indentation pulsed faintly beneath my fingertips, mirroring the thudding that still resonated within the bone structure. I pulled out my notepad, meticulously copying the pattern, attempting to translate it into something comprehensible. Coordinates were useless. Standard mapping techniques failed. It wasn't about where the roads were, but when they connected. The televisions continued their silent chorus of static, the grey swirling with hypnotic intensity. The remnant of Daniel remained collapsed, a discarded husk. The cat, now rubbing against my leg, felt unnervingly warm, its purr a low, grating vibration. I ignored it, focusing on the map. The pattern resolved into a series of numbers, not sequential, but seemingly arbitrary. 17, 429, 811, 3. I recognized the numbers. They weren't T-coordinates or dates. They were channel frequencies. Old analog television channels. Channels that hadn't T-broadcast for decades. A wave of nausea washed over me. The floral scent had become overpowering, cloying like being buried alive in a funeral bouquet. I tried the radio in the cruiser. Static, of course. But then, a flicker. A brief burst of audio, not from a radio station, but from one of the channels on the map. A woman's voice, distorted and fragmented, reciting numbers. The same numbers, 17, 429, 811, 3. What the hell? I muttered, frantically adjusting the dial. The signal was weak, intermittent, but persistent. The voice continued, repeating the sequence, interspersed with bursts of static and a low, droning hum. It sounded like a countdown. I returned to the room with the televisions, scanning the screens. One of them flickered, the static momentarily resolving into a distorted image. A field. Not the brittle cornfield surrounding the county, but a field of sunflowers, their faces turned towards a grey, overcast sky, and in the center of the field, a single dilapidated structure, a water tower. I referenced the image with old aerial photographs of the county. The water tower, it had been demolished in 1968. The location corresponded to one of the indentations on the bone wall, Channel 17. I grabbed my flashlight, ignoring the cat, her unwavering gaze, and retraced my steps through the labyrinthine corridors. The thudding had intensified, now accompanied by a high-pitched whine that resonated deep within my skull. I found another room, larger than the others, dominated by a single object, a chair, not an ordinary chair, but a dental chair, its leather cracked and peeling, its metal frame rusted and stained, straps hung loose, dangling like severed ligaments. And above the chair, suspended from the ceiling by a thick chain, a single, bare light bulb flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows. The air here was colder, heavier, and the floral scent was gone, replaced by something else entirely, something metallic, something bloody. The dental chair wasn't merely old, it had been suistade. Not for dental work, I suspected. The leather was scored with deep gouges, the metal frame pitted with what looked like acid burns. A small porcelain basin beneath the chair was filled with a viscous black fluid. It didn't smell of blood, not exactly. More like iron filings and spoiled honey, a sickly, sweet, metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the room. The walls were lined with shelves, filled not with medical instruments, but with jars. Glass jars of varying sizes, each containing a single object suspended in a murky formaldehyde, like liquid. Eyes, severed eyes, staring blankly upwards. Dozens of them. Hundreds. The cat, having followed me, sat at the doorway, observing the scene with an unnerving calmness. It hadn't he meowed, hadn't he moved, hadn't he even blinked. Just a silent, watchful presence. I forced myself to focus, to remain detached. This wasn't it about emotion, it was about data, about establishing a pattern, about understanding the odds. I returned to the map, comparing the room's location to the sequence of numbers. Channel 29, the voice on the radio, the sunflowers, the demolished water tower. It was a circuit, a loop. Each channel, each location, connected to the next, forming a closed system. A feedback loop of distorted signals and decaying matter. I switched the radio back on, tuning to channel 29. The woman's voice was clearer now, though still fragmented and distorted. The calibration is almost complete. The vessel is prepared. The resonance will amplify. The light bulb above the dental chair flickered violently, then died, plunging the room into near darkness. I switched on the high beam of my flashlight, sweeping it across the room. And that? Scratched into the bone wall behind the chair, a single word repeatedly, over and over. We yield. The word wasn't. He'd written in paint or ink, but carved into the bone, as if with a sharp, deliberate instrument. The letters were jagged, uneven, and filled with the same black fluid that filled the basin beneath the chair. I ran my hand over the carvings, feeling the rough texture of the bone beneath my fingertips. The words seemed to vibrate, to resonate with the thudding that still permeated the structure. A noise from the corner of the room, a scraping sound. I swung the flashlight around, illuminating a small metal table. On the table, a single object, a tuning fork, old, tarnished, and covered in the same black fluid. I picked it up hesitantly. It felt cold, heavy in my hand. I struck the tuning fork against the metal frame of the chair. A high, pitched, resonant tone filled the room, vibrating through my bones. The thudding intensified, reaching a deafening crescendo. And then a voice. Not from the radio, not from the televisions, but from within the room. A chorus of whispers, murmuring the same word. Fu yield, 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 asterisk. The eyes in the jars began to rattle, their sockets shaking violently, and the cat finally moved. It arched its back, its fur standing on end, and let out a long, drawn-out hiss. It wasn't hissing at me, it was hissing at the chair. The hiss wasn't a warning, it was a recognition. The cat knew something I didn't. Something about the chair, about the room, about the escalating resonance. I struck the tuning fork again, a desperate attempt to understand, to control the escalating chaos. The whispers intensified, coalescing into a single coherent voice. A woman's voice, the same voice from the radio. Almost there. The frequency is aligning. The vessel will open. The chair began to vibrate subtly at first, then with increasing intensity. The metal frame rattled, the leather creaked, and the black fluid in the basin sloshed violently. I shone the flashlight on the restraints, noticing something I'd missed before. Small, metallic loops woven into the leather, designed not to hold a patient 40 down, but to connect to something else. Wires. Thin, almost invisible wires that snaked across the floor, disappearing into the bone walls. I followed the wires, tracing their path through the room. They led to a control panel hidden behind a tapestry depicting a field of sunflowers, the same sunflowers from the distorted image on the television. The panel was covered in dials, switches, and gauges, all labeled with cryptic symbols and numbers. It looked less like medical equipment and more like the control system for a complex machine. I cautiously flipped a switch. The light bulb above the chair flickered back to life, illuminating the room with a harsh, sterile glow. The vibrations intensified, and the chair began to fight rises, slowly lifting off the floor. The wires tightened, pulling it upwards towards a circular opening in the ceiling. An opening I hadn't noticed before. The opening wasn't a hole, but a distortion, a shimmering heat haze effect that warped the air around it. It resembled a lens focusing the room's energy into a single point. The voice from the radio reached a fever pitch. Now the resonance is complete. Prepare for transmission. The cat leaped onto the control panel, its paws dancing across the dials and switches. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. It was 20 adjusting, the settings fine. Tuning the machine, it seemed to understand the controls better than I did. I tried to pull the cat away, but it swatted at my hand, its claws extended. It hissed again, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down my spine. It was protecting the machine, protecting the process. The chair was now suspended in mid-air directly beneath the opening. The distortion in the ceiling intensified, growing larger, more unstable. And then I saw it. Reflected in the polished bone walls, a figure standing behind me. Not Daniel Hemlock, not anymore. It was a silhouette vaguely human in shape, but distorted, elongated, as if stretched and pulled in multiple directions. It wasn't casting a shadow, it was a shadow. A living, breathing shadow, coalescing from the darkness, and it was reaching for me. The silhouette wasn't approaching, it was folding. Like a paper origami, its form shifting and reforming, angles sharpening, limbs extending. It lacked detail, existing as a negative space against the dim light, yet possessed a weight, a density that pressed against my chest. I tried to shout, but my voice caught in my throat, constricted by a rising panic. I swung my flashlight, the beam passing through the figure as if it was smoke. It didn't react. It continued to unfold, its form becoming increasingly grotesque, resembling a fractured mannequin constructed from shadows. I stumbled backwards, colliding with the metal table, sending the tuning fork clattering to the floor. The cat ignored me, its focus entirely on the control panel. It continued to manipulate the dials, its movements precise and deliberate. The chair vibrated violently, the wires straining, and the opening in the ceiling pulsed with an eerie blue light. The voice on the radio was gone, replaced by a cacophony of static and distorted whispers. I noticed something then. The shadow figure wasn't simply unfolding, it was replicating. Smaller, fragmented shadows began to emerge from its form, detaching themselves and drifting towards the walls. They weren't independent entities, but extensions of the original, like tendrils reaching out to claim the room. I grabbed the tuning fork, desperate for something to anchor me to reality. I struck it against the chair, hoping to disrupt the resonance, to break the connection. The high-pitched tone momentarily drowned out the whispers, but it had no effect on the shadow figure. If anything, it seemed to accelerate its unfolding. The chair was now directly beneath the opening, suspended by a single frayed wire. The blue light intensified, bathing the room in an unearthly glow. The air crackled with energy, and the smell of ozone filled my nostrils. I looked at the cat. It had stopped manipulating the controls. It was sitting perfectly still, its gaze fixed on the chair, its body rigid with anticipation. It wasn't watching the chair. It was watching something inside. The chair. I followed its gaze, and that's when I saw it. A faint outline barely visible within the chair's restraints. A human form, but not Daniel Hemlock. Not anymore. It was a distorted, fragmented version of him. His limbs twisted at impossible angles. His face contorted in a silent scream. It was a copy, an imperfect replica. The opening in the ceiling widened, and a beam of blue light enveloped the chair. The replica began to dissolve, its form breaking down into particles of light. The light flowed upwards into the opening and then vanished. The chair dropped to the floor with a deafening crash. The wires snapped. The room fell silent. The shadow figure retracted, collapsing inwards, its form shrinking until it resembled a dark stain on the wall. The cat turned to me, its eyes glowing with an unnerving intelligence. It let out a single, soft meow, and then it began to walk. Not towards the door, but towards the opening in the ceiling. The cat didn't jump. It simply foishwat. Up the wall, its claws finding purchase on the smooth bone surface. It moved with an unnatural grace, defying gravity, ascending towards the opening as if walking on solid ground. The blue light had faded, but the distortion in the ceiling remained, a shimmering oval of warped reality. I stood frozen, unable to process what I was witnessing. The room felt emptier, not devoid of presence, but as if a crucial component had been removed. The thudding had stopped completely. The whispers were gone. Only the faint hum of the control panel remained, a low, persistent drone. I approached the chair cautiously. The replica of Daniel was gone, completely dissolved. The restraints were empty, save for a few lingering particles of blue light. I ran my hand over the leather, feeling a faint warmth, a residual energy. It felt wrong, like touching a phantom limb. I examined the control panel, attempting to decipher the cryptic symbols and numbers. It was a complex system, far beyond my comprehension. But I noticed something. A small, circular gauge, labeled with a single word, calibration. The needle was stuck at 0, and beneath the gauge a small handwritten note, Phase 1 complete. Phase 1. What did that mean? Was this some kind of experiment? Some kind of transmission? I looked up at the opening in the ceiling. The cat had reached it, and was now disappearing into the distortion, its form dissolving into the shimmering light. I grabbed my radio, attempting to contact dispatch. Static, of course. I tried every frequency, every channel, nothing. The radio was dead. I was completely cut off. I decided to follow the cat. It was a reckless, illogical decision, but I felt compelled to do so. I had to understand what was happening. I had to find Daniel Hemlock, or what was left of him. I found a ladder hidden behind the tapestry, a rickety metal structure that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. I tested it cautiously, and it held. I began to climb, ascending towards the opening, towards the unknown. The air grew colder with each step. The floral scent, which had faded earlier, returned with a vengeance, now laced with a metallic tang. The walls around me seemed to be shifting, subtly changing shape. The bone surface felt slick, almost organic. I reached the opening and stopped. It wasn't a ceiling. It wasn't a portal to another dimension. It was a room, a vast, cavernous space filled with rows upon rows of identical dental chairs. Each chair occupied by a figure, each figure contorted, folded, dissolving into blue light. And above them, suspended from the ceiling by a network of wires, a single, enormous tuning fork, vibrating, resonating, the source of the thudding. The source of the whispers, the source of everything. The scale was impossible. The cavernous space stretched beyond the reach of my flashlight beam, filled with an endless array of dental chairs and dissolving figures. It wasn't a room, it was a processing center, a factory, a place where human bodies were disassembled and reconfigured. The air thrummed with energy, a palpable vibration that rattled my teeth. I clung to the ladder, my knuckles white, struggling to maintain my grip. Below, the bone structure of the previous room seemed to be dissolving, merging with the cavern walls. The entire facility was alive. Shifting, adapting. The cat was nowhere to be seen. It had vanished into the sea of chairs, becoming one with the distorted landscape. I scanned the rows, searching for any sign of Daniel Hemlock, but it was futile. Every figure was a fragmented, unrecognizable mess. I noticed something then. The chairs weren't arranged randomly. They were positioned in a precise geometric pattern, forming a complex fractal design, and at the center of the pattern, a single empty chair, perfectly positioned, waiting. A voice echoed through the cavern, not from the radio, but directly into my mind. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it felt familiar, like a distorted echo of my own thoughts. Calibration is complete. The vessel is ready. The resonance is optimized. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the voice, but it persisted, weaving its way into my consciousness. It was probing, analyzing, assessing. It was measuring me. I opened my eyes and looked down at my hands. They were trembling, covered in a fine layer of dust. I wiped my hand across my forehead, and my fingers came away stained with the same black fluid that filled the basin in the other room. It wasn't on my skin. It was 20 my skin. I looked at my reflection in the polished metal of the ladder. My face was gaunt, pale, and wrong. My features seemed to be shifting, blurring, as if my identity was dissolving. The voice spoke again. Subject identified. Milo Lee. Parameters confirmed. Integration sequence initiated. I felt a sharp pain in my temples, a searing pressure building behind my eyes. My vision blurred, and the cavern began to spin. The rows of chairs seemed to converge, to focus on me. The dissolving figures reached out, their fragmented limbs stretching towards me like grasping claws. I tried to climb down the ladder, but my muscles wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed, trapped. The voice was growing louder, more insistent. Yield, 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 yield. I looked up at the enormous tuning fork, vibrating with an unearthly energy. It wasn't just creating sound, it was creating reality. It was reshaping the fabric of space and time. And then I understood. The cat wasn't guiding me. It was leading me to my destination. It wasn't an observer. It was a facilitator. It was preparing me for transmission, the empty chair. It wasn't waiting for Daniel Hemlock. It was waiting for me. The paralysis wasn't physical. It was structural. My sense of self was unraveling. My memories fragmenting. My identity dissolving into the resonant frequency of the cavern. The voice wasn't external anymore. It was within me, dictating my thoughts, controlling my actions. I descended the ladder not by choice, but by compulsion. My feet moved with a mechanical precision, guiding me towards the empty chair. The rows of dissolving figures parted before me, as if acknowledging my arrival. Their silent screams echoed in my mind, a chorus of despair. I reached the chair and sat down. The leather felt cold, slick against my skin. The restraints tightened around my limbs, not painfully but with a firm, deliberate pressure. I didn't resist. Resistance was futile. The wires connected to my temples, sending a surge of energy through my nervous system. My vision exploded in a kaleidoscope of colors and shapes. The cavern dissolved, replaced by a swirling vortex of light and darkness. I was no longer in a physical space. I was in a state of pure sensation. The voice spoke clear and unwavering, initiating calibration, aligning neural pathways, preparing for transmission. I felt my mind being dissected, analyzed. Reassembled, my memories were extracted, sorted, and categorized. My fears, my desires, my regrets, all laid bare. It wasn't painful, but it was profoundly violating. I saw flashes of my past, my childhood home, my father's funeral, a forgotten argument with a friend. Each memory was distorted, fragmented, stripped of its emotional context. They were being reduced to data points, to raw information. I tried to cling to my identity, to hold on to something real, but it was slipping away. I was becoming empty, a vessel, a conduit. And then I saw her, the woman from the radio. Not as a voice, but as a presence. She wasn't human, not entirely. Her form was fluid, shifting, composed of the same blue light that enveloped the dissolving figures. She was the architect of this place, the orchestrator of this process. She looked at me, her eyes devoid of emotion. You are the final component, the key to unlocking the full potential of the resonance. I tried to speak, to protest, but my voice was gone. I was merely a receptor, a passive observer. She raised her hand and a beam of blue light enveloped my head. The pain was excruciating, but I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. I could only feel. I felt my consciousness expanding, merging with the cavern, with the chairs, with the dissolving figures. I was becoming part of the system, part of the resonance, and then I understood the purpose of it all. It wasn't about abduction. It wasn't about experimentation. It was about replication, about creating a perfect copy. A perfect vessel. A perfect transmission. The sensation wasn't annihilation, but dispersal. My consciousness wasn't extinguished. It was fragmented, scattered across the network of chairs, woven into the fabric of the cavern. I was no longer Milo Lee. I was a component of frequency. A ripple in the resonance. I experienced everything simultaneously. The silent screams of the dissolving figures, the hum of the tuning fork, the cold, calculating presence of the woman, the endless geometric pattern of the chairs. I saw the cat. It was standing on the control panel, overseeing the process, its eyes glowing with an unsettling satisfaction. It wasn't a creature of this world. It was a guardian, a caretaker, a facilitator of the transmission. A new figure materialized in the empty chair. It looked like me, exactly like me. But it wasn't me. It was a perfect replica, constructed from the fragments of my consciousness, molded by the resonance. It sat perfectly still, its eyes vacant, its face devoid of emotion. The woman approached the replica, her fluid form shimmering in the blue light. She reached out and touched its forehead. The replica's eyes flickered to life. "Transmission complete," she said, her voice echoing through the cavern. "The vessel is ready." The replica stood up, its movements fluid and precise. It walked towards the opening in the ceiling, towards the distorted reality beyond. I felt a strange detachment, a sense of relief. The pain was gone. The fear was gone. I was no longer burdened by the weight of my own consciousness. I was simply part of something larger, something incomprehensible, but then a flicker of awareness, a fragment of my former self clinging to the edges of the resonance. A single, defiant thought. It's not over. I scanned the cavern, searching for something, anything that could explain this lingering sensation, and then I saw it. A single, overlooked detail. A small, circular indentation on the bone wall, hidden behind the control panel. It didn't contain a dried flower. It contained a photograph. A faded, black and white photograph of a field of sunflowers, and in the center of the field a demolished water tower. But something was different. In the photograph there was a figure standing near the water tower, a small, indistinct figure, holding something, a tuning fork. The photograph wasn't a record of the past. It was a prediction of the future. The cycle wasn't complete. It was about to begin again, and I, or what was left of me, was trapped within it, a silent observer. A fragmented echo, a warning. The resonance continued to hum. The chairs continued to dissolve. The replica continued its journey, and the cat, still perched on the control panel, continued to watch, waiting for the next calibration, waiting for the next vessel, waiting for the next transmission.